which tends to happen a lot. He's fairly consistent in that regard. When not writing for various locations, including Bandcamp, The Quietus, and KQED Arts, he tends to be thinking about things like whether Dorothy Dunnett's novels will ever be properly adapted for movies or TV.
True.
And today, Ned will be presenting Vibrating Together Within the Infinite, Reflections on the Azusa Plane's Armonia Aphanes Phaneros Kreisson. Please welcome Ned Raggett.
The song that you're about to hear slowly fade up and hopefully not overwhelm what I say, and if it does, I'll adjust the volume down a bit, is indeed the song Armonia Aphanes Phaneros Kreisson. It is the concluding song on the Azusa Plane's debut album, Tychomagnetic Anomaly and the Full Consciousness of Hidden Harmony. The song was written by Jason DiEmilio, who was the person who founded the Azusa Plane. He made it a one-man band, essentially, although he did work with others in various live contexts. He died late October 2006, at the age of 36. The album was one of the first releases on the Camera Obscura label, a label out of Australia founded by a gentleman named Tony Dale. Tony died midsummer of 2010, at the age of 51. A celebrator of both Jason's work and Tony's work is a guy named Lee Jackson, a fellow from Texas, a writer and enthusiast. He died March 2012, age of 38. Lee's death occurred 7 years ago, essentially, at the EMP pop conference that was held at NYU. It was at the end of one of the panels. I happened to be checking Twitter or Facebook or something, and I forget who made the announcement, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the news broke that Lee had died. This was a shock to me, and I will explain why in a little bit. The following day, still taking that in, I ended up reaching out to one of his fellow writers, a guy named Mats Gustafsson, who worked with him closely. Matt suggested a friend of Lee's named Travis Johnson, and the three of us began work on a digital tribute album that is available through Bandcamp. It is titled For Lee Jackson in Space, referencing the Pearls Before Swine song For the Dead in Space. The project, for lack of a better word, was a fundraiser. This was a fundraiser done to support research into ALS, or also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. This is what killed Lee. You may, and I encourage you to, please, go to the For Lee Jackson in Space Bandcamp. The fundraiser is over. You may listen to all the tracks on the album. Something like 80 bands participated. It's very long. Nearly all the tracks were tracks that were created for that album. There was one exception, this one. I decided to reach out to Carol Dale, Tony Dale's widow, and to Vanita Joshi, the executor of Jason DiEmilio's estate. And I asked them, could I please use this song as the concluding number? Because in my mind, it was a way to acknowledge not merely Lee, but to acknowledge an artist and a label head who had done so much. They had done so much in a scene that, for all intents and purposes, I would not call dead. It is not. But in a way, it is gone. It is absent. The through line was the series of Terrastock festivals that were done inspired by the Ptolemaic Terrascope fan scene founded by Philip McMullen in 1980. In the 1980s. This was done partially to encourage a continuing interest in psychedelia, as broadly defined, both in terms of older artists and the many newer artists working in the tradition, however defined, since then. The last Terrastock concert, which was the last time I saw Lee, was in 2008. The last time I saw Tony was Terrastock 4, that was held here in Seattle. That was in 2000. The only time I saw Jason was Terrastock 2. That was in 1998. I cannot claim that I was close friends with any of these men. I don't wish to claim that. I want to make that clear. Tony and I, and Lee and I, were very friendly acquaintances, and we were in touch online through wider circles. I never properly met Jason at all. Thinking about this song, and I admit I'm sort of catching up a bit as I hear it play now, and thinking about the three of them brings together a lot of memories, and brings together a certain desire, I admit, on my part to make sure that these men are not forgotten. That's one reason why I put this together, and why I'm speaking mostly extemporaneously. I'm not trying to paste anyone into the canon here, although I tried in my own way. I reviewed an Azusa Plane collection that was put out by Veneta, Where the Sands Turned to Gold, for Pitchfork some years ago. I wrote Tony Dale's obituary for the brainwash.com site, at the invitation of its founder, John Whitney. And as mentioned, I helped put together the fundraiser for Lee. I'm just here to talk about these three men briefly, a little bit of time here, and talk about how they lived and how they died. I mentioned what Lee died of, ALS. And the thing was, I didn't know he suffered from it. In fact, fairly few people did. He chose not to communicate this, and that was for his own reasons, which I will not question. And since he was very comfortable talking with many people online, it was easy not to know this. His close friends and family were very well aware. Lee was a very gregarious Texan. The best stereotype of a Texan you can imagine. If all Texans were like this, it'd be such a great world. He was an enthusiast in the best possible sense. A writer, a founder of a publication called The Broken Face, which, though it's Pixies referencing, granted, was essentially an American equivalent to the Ptolemaic Terrascope. I ended up writing for it a couple of times towards the end of its run. He and Mats Gustafsson were the ones who founded it, and very much in imitation of the Ptolemaic Terrascope. And it was a wonderful outlet to learn about more bands, more people working again in this broader psychedelic tradition. I first encountered Lee when he was selling copies of it at Terrastock 5 in Boston. And it was very easy to get on board with it and with him. Very easy and very simple. There were wider contexts for discussion on the internet when it came to psych drone stuff, however defined, throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. So I was a bit of a latecomer, you could say. My interests are always sort of bouncing all around, but there's a through line for me. So getting to know Lee, a little too late, because I would have loved to have known him a lot longer. That was a treasure. And in the liner notes for the fundraiser collection we put together, Mats and his friend Travis Johnson speak much more eloquently about Lee than I could, about the long, deep friendships they had. Travis specifically about how Lee got him out of his shell to a large degree, introduced him to so many things, not merely music, movies, art, and, I will add, Lee was a man of very strong Christian faith, too. He showed that there are no ways to easily stereotype someone. Lee's passing again was so sudden, so wrong. He was there and then he wasn't. A voice no longer on my Facebook feed, a voice no longer there. The Broken Face had wrapped up, yes, but that was just by a mutual decision of Travis and Lee, totally fine. And he had continued work on his Womb Life blog, and then that now stopped. The suddenness was horrible, even though what happened, again, was unfortunately not too surprising. As I understand it, he suffered a particular attack relating to his ALS. They were rushing him to the hospital. He never made it. One of the songs on the fundraiser by a fellow, Alan Davison, I hope I have the name right, he performs as the Kitchen Cynics. He wrote the song Me, Jack, and Lee and the Ghost of Skip James. This particular song is referring to a conversation that was held at Terrastock 3. I would have loved to have been there, I wasn't there. Apparently it was late in the evening, and it was Lee Jackson talking with Jack Rose. He's gone now too. And they were talking about Skip James, himself long gone. And whenever I hear this song, and if there was time and context, I would love to play it at you, I just imagine what it would like to be there. And Alan, I think, documenting just this moment in time that was evanescent and gone. I'd love to say a little more about Lee, but as I mentioned, it was more an impression, the person who was there, that I caught as I could. Always a welcome presence. Those who love and miss him more, say more, as I mentioned in the fundraiser liner notes. I encourage you to read them. Let me talk a little more about Tony Dale now. Tony was Australian, I think I mentioned. I'll mention it again. And he had his own life writing. That was his thing. He very much locked into Ptolemaic Terrascope early on, contributed many articles for it. And over time, he got that idea, that one step beyond that I've never done. He thought, why not found a label? Why not found a label for all these bands who are so wonderful and do something about it? And he did. Camera Obscura released something like 80 albums over the course of, something like, if I remember right, 12, 13 years. And he would still be doing it if he were here, I'm sure. In an interview once, Tony talked about how the label, Camera Obscura, was meant to be, as he put it, and I'll quote him, about how it began as a conduit for the release of contemporary acid folk, psych pop, and space rock. That's still who we are, though the boundaries have been allowed to stretch and to blur. I like that. I like that open-mindedness. It's reflected in the label. There is no one sound. Instead, there are cavalcades of sounds. Psychedelia as defined by him, but something that fits within that wider context that was established by the Terrastock festivals, by Ptolemaic Terrascope, by people who realize there's no one right way to do things. And it's also interesting to note that he founded what's essentially a CD label. Now that sounds strange in context, because if I told you right now, say someone had found a label and they only wanted to release CDs, everyone in this room would be like, you only want to release CDs? Really? Because what is the model? Because what is the model right now? The model is, oh, you press vinyl because that's the way it's real, and otherwise we'll work out the stringing arrangement. Now, Tony would have loved to release more vinyl. He regretted he didn't. He did release various vinyl things along the way. And towards the end of the label's run, you found the space to release more, precisely because there was greater interest starting to happen around the end of the 2000s. He didn't get the chance to do more. So when I first thought of this particular paper presentation, there I was, just sitting at my desk next to my one CD rack that I have, big one, and I have the complete run of the Camera Obscura label there, something I collected after Tony passed. I wanted to have an accounting of it. I wanted to have everything that he had a hand in, that he had something to do there. That made thinking of this paper very easy. Tony was a funny, funny guy. He was hilarious. He was engaged, enthusiastic, much like Lee was, that same sort of love for everything. Unlike Lee, he was more honest about his condition. I shouldn't say honest, that's a poor choice of word, excuse me. He was more open about it, much better choice. He chose to do this because that's what he felt he could do. In this case, he had suffered from cancer, he had gone into remission, came back. He found himself lucky, as I think he believed he would have thought of it. It was approaching the end of the Australian tax year, and he chose to wrap up Camera Obscura, end it, so that way it wouldn't be a financial burden or anything like that to his family, to his widow. Just simply close the books. He was honest, as I said, about these things, or open, again, something on that word. And one of the things I find most remarkable about what happened was this. As word got out, a bunch of bands got into conversation, bands on his label, bands who he'd worked with, and all the rest of it. They all set up individually wherever they were around the world, set up and created and recorded a live set in rehearsal rooms or things like that. Created videos that they sent to him, so that way in hospice care, wherever he was, he could enjoy his own private festival. Those recordings have never been released. They were only for him. And I still remember about a week after he died. About a week after he died, waking up at about 3 a.m. so I could go to my parents' computer. I was visiting home at the time, flip it open, and watch the live stream memorial service from Australia. I'm glad of that moment. I could say more about Tony, and I wish I could. Again, I defer to others. And I wish I could say more about Jason. And this is the hardest part. Lee's passing, Tony's passing, the horribleness of fate, disease, conditions beyond control. You've heard Jason's music. By all accounts, when he started recording, doing stuff in the early 90s, he was the guy in Philadelphia. He essentially founded a scene that got the stereotypical name, but I think it works, 90s scene called Psychedelphia. There was even a compilation release called Sounds of Psychedelphia. There was an actual psychedelic scene, much within this vein, that flourished in Philadelphia. And by all accounts, he was kind of the catalyst. He was one saying, let's do this, just by being so active. He was releasing stuff all the time throughout the 90s into the early 2000s. This was from his first full debut album, but he had released tapes, splits, things like this over the course of years. Done some live recordings, things like that. As I mentioned, the one time I saw him would have been at Terrastock 2. wonderful, wonderful performance, a three-piece performance that was just this huge, overwhelming thing. I can only describe as the American equivalent of something like the legendary Japanese band High Rise or something like that. Something that's a power trio that's exultant, that lifts you up and sends you out. It was amazing. You can hear the recording on the live album, The Result Dies with the Worker. You can sense from the sounds you're hearing what Jason really liked. This sense of overwhelming sound. Something transcendent, something that sends you beyond. It wasn't, and not every track is like this, not everything he ever did, but this gives you an idea of it, sort of an excelsis. This idea that something is just huge sounding. It's the type of music that for me is perhaps still the most important type I've ever heard. It's not the only thing I like, but to me this is what sends me to another place. If My Bloody Valentine soon was the catalyst for me, as I've written about before, this is one of the big landmarks still along the way. And how can I say this? How can we live? You didn't use earplugs. You suffered from tinnitus, and you're thinking, okay, maybe a lot of us do. I do. Constant little ringing in your ears. I have it. I know it. I do my best to alleviate that. But I mentioned these extremities that he would send himself to, the sound, the idea of him recording this, the live performances, sticking his head inside drum sets, things like that. He didn't just have tinnitus in the end. He had something called hyperacusis. You might not know this term. I didn't know it. Here's what hyperacusis is like. Imagine this room was totally dead silent, an anechoic chamber where the only thing you hear is simply the sound of your own body, the pulse of your heart. Imagine I did this, and you're like, okay, you snapped your fingers. Imagine if for a person suffering hyperacusis, it's like this. That little snap was a thunderbolt, exploding right next to your ear. It's a rewiring of the brain. It's a very poorly understood condition. But I ask you to think about that if that one little sound turns into something like that, what do you think it sounds like if you're dealing with the noise of everyday life? I recommend to you the article by Joyce Cohen, who suffers from it herself, from March 2013, from BuzzFeed. The story is called When Everyday Sound Becomes Torture. The extremity that people go to try and find silence, to try and have sound be as minimal as possible, just to live. Jason tried. He withdrew from music. He sought out specialists. Many said he suffered nothing. He tried to restrict what he did, his communications, even with close family and friends, by email, something where he didn't have to say much. In October 2006, he reached his limit. I don't need to tell you the details. He left a note. Here's part of that note, as quoted in the article I mentioned. All the things that made me happy now kill me. I suffer all the time. I'm tired. I'm tired of pain and medication and side effects and head pain and ear pain. I am tired of being trapped and imprisoned in my body. No one could ever possibly understand this thing that has happened to me and the utter despair, grief, and sadness I feel all the time. There is never a good night, a good day, a good weekend, a good vacation. It is just torment. Every place I go is too loud. I can't listen to music even at the lowest volume. It's torture. Towards the end of the note, he wrote this: I don't want to die. I want to live. This is not a life for anyone. And I can't believe it. It's all gone. There is no music. It is quiet. And it is the sound of death. There's not much more I can add. I have no big lesson to share. But maybe you sense why, when I play this song, why I chose it for Lee's fundraiser. I think of the three of them: Lee, and Tony and Jason, why I claim to think of them as vibrating together within the infinite, beyond what they suffer, beyond all this pain. I have only half a minute left, so I ask you briefly to do what I do at times like this, to simply take a little time and listen.